Well, we've gotten to a point we can ignore it no longer. We have to think about data access and our tests. So that's what we'll be doing in this module. And by the way, if you're curious what you're looking at, that's Hogmanay in Scotland, in Edinburgh. What a great time that was. So in this module, we are going to do an overview of ORMs and data access with Node. Just a quick overview in case you're not familiar. Then we're going to ignore it all with Sinon-JS stubs. Something you haven't seen just yet. We've worked with spies. Next up are stubs. Then we're going to work with a repository and dependency injection. We're going to use some patterns to help us ignore data access altogether. Finally, we're going to use some helpers, and we're going to finish up the review process. Try and keep our tests light and lean. For the first segment, however, let's take a look at ORMs in Node.js. If you're familiar with these things already, you can go ahead and skip to the next clip. The first one I want to talk about is ORM2. This supports, as you would expect, various databases, including Postgres, SQLite, Mongo, and so on. It has a syntax here. You just require it. You connect to your database, and then you define your model as you see here. And this includes all kinds of schema information, various methods, and validations. If you're familiar with Active Record or things like it, well, this kind of works pretty much the same way. You can see person.find. That's how you do the querying with it. Next up is Sequelize. Sequelize works in pretty much the same way. It supports a bunch of different databases. You basically declare a model. And one additional feature that Sequelize has is it allows you to also update your database when you change the underlying schema in your model. I think that's pretty neat. It's also very involved. We'll talk more about that in just a bit. You'll find that as you look over these ORMs, they pretty much all work the same way. You define a model by passing in some kind of object that has schema information on it, and it also abstracts data types for you. Here we have generic data types: string, binary, integer, big int, float, decimal, date, boolean, etc. It'll do its best to translate that for you and put it in your database. All right, well, let's take a look at another one here. It's Waterline. This is the ORM that is behind sales.js. It's pretty fascinating. I've used this thing before. I really like it. And it does, as you would expect, the same deal. Here you define a model. This is a user, and it's got attributes on it. And then you tell it what type it is, if it's required, all those good things. It works with the concept of adapters. And as you can see, it works with a bunch of databases: Mongo, React, Postgres, MySQL, and so on. If you want to get underneath the covers, you sure can. You can go in and tell it what table to use if there's a given schema. If not, if you're using Mongo, well, it'll ignore it altogether. There's that find syntax. That is pretty much ubiquitous, with some small changes between all of the ORMs that you're about to see. Then there's Bookshelf. This is the one that's used by the Ghost project, Ghost blogging project. It actually uses Backbone under the covers, and it's, again, fairly simple to use. It's built on top of Connects. Connects is kind of a low-level way of working with a database. You tell it what client you're using and where that database is, and then Bookshelf works on top of that. It abstracts it a little bit. It allows you to define models, as you see here, using same old strings, booleans, and so on. Well, if I sound a little bit jaded and a little bit, fatigued, I guess, with all these ORM discussions, well, that's because I am. I find ORMs to be distracting and unneeded. I really don't like the idea of abstracting the power of SQL away, and that's what you get when you work with these ORMs. They sort of want to work across all database platforms, and you really can't get into the nuances of any one in particular. I think that's a little bit silly, especially if you're working with something like Postgres. That's a whole subject for a whole other video. The only reason I bring this up is to transition to the next part here, which is something that I created. This is Massive.js. Massive has been around for years in the .NET world, but also in the JavaScript world, and I redid it with Massive 2.0 to work directly with Postgres. I just want to tell you that it's out there. If you're a SQL lover like me and you want to work directly with SQL files as functions and whatnot, well, here it is. It's not really an ORM. I guess it's more of a data access tool. And as I mentioned, you can have SQL files as functions, which I think is pretty neat. You can also work with your typical find syntax, although there's no concept of a model, so you're free to query it as you please. It also allows you to work directly with JSON-B as if you're working with a NoSQL situation, which could be very, very useful when you're working with Node. In fact, it's more than just slightly useful. Often when you're building out your application, you don't want to think about schema, but you might think about it later on. I'm going to touch on this later. For right now, let's do our best to ignore this decision. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go in and I'm going to create a brand new folder. I'm going to call it DB for now. Inside of DB, I'm just going to create a brand new file. And for lack of better words, I'll just call it index.js. The reason I'm doing this is I want to abstract away the notion of data access for now. And I'm going to use Sinon to stub this out. And I'll show you that in 2 seconds. First, though, I want to create the methods that I'll be calling later on. And I'm just going to do this using straight up exports functionality. This is going to make our DB module here a singleton. If you don't know what I'm talking about, maybe pause the video for a second and go have a quick review on some of the other Pluralsight courses, or go take a quick look on Google at node modules and how they work. This is actually really, really important. It's a big design consideration when you're designing out your module. Do you want to have a singleton here that always works on the same instance, or do you want to return individual instances? I have to tackle this very question in one of the upcoming clips.